There's a river that runs through the heart of a forgotten town. No one swims in it. No one dares fish from its banks. And when the wind howls across its black surface on a moonless night, it doesn't whisper, it screams. Once every generation, something wakes beneath the water. And once every year, on the exact day a child was claimed by the current over a century ago, the river does the impossible. It flows backward. This isn't just a story. It's a curse passed through bloodlines, witnessed in whispers, recorded in dreams, and feared across 7 generations. Each chapter brings you closer to the truth. But don't think you're safe just because you're reading it. Because what happens in that river doesn't always stay there. Do you believe a curse can stretch across time? Have you ever felt watched near water? Tell me in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who loves horror, but only if they're brave enough. The year was 1872 and the town of Darrow's Hollow nestled in the crook of the Black Ridge Mountains like a forgotten secret. No one came there unless they were born in its soil or cursed enough to find themselves wandering too far off any known road. Fog hung low over the water most mornings, curling around the trunks of withered trees like ghost fingers. And through the heart of it all, the river ran, dark, slow, and cruel. Locals called it the Weeping Vein. They said the river had memory. Clara Vexley was 12 the first time she heard the river speak. She'd followed her older brother Emmett down to the bank against her mother's orders. "Don't go near the water, Clara," her mother hissed every morning. "It remembers." Emmett, 17 and fearless, never listened. "The river's just water," he'd scoff. "You let it scare you, it wins." His voice always dropped when he said that, like it was a challenge. That day, they crept down to where the rocks grew slick with moss and the trees leaned too far inward. Clara clutched a rusted lantern while Emmett carried his old slingshot, pretending he was some kind of explorer. But even he grew quiet when they reached the river's edge. It wasn't the fog that unsettled them. It wasn't even the silence. It was the way the current stopped. Clara blinked. The water, usually sluggish but steady, had stilled like frozen glass. Not a ripple, not a breath. And then, right before her eyes, it began to pull backward. Not quickly, not like rapids or some illusion, but a deliberate crawl, as if the river itself was rewinding. A strange groaning echoed deep beneath the earth, like something massive turning in its sleep. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Emmett nodded slowly, his eyes wide. "We need to go." But Clara couldn't move. The river was doing something else now. Shapes were forming beneath the surface. Faces, pale and bloated, mouths open in silent screams. Fingers stretched toward the surface, dragging against the current as if begging to be released. One face looked like hers. "Clara!" Emmett screamed, grabbing her hand. She stumbled backward just as a hand, cold, wet, and real, snatched at her ankle. Her lantern crashed against a rock, shattering and sending flickering light across the mist. In that moment of chaos, she saw it, a shadow rising from the water, tall and impossibly thin, like bones wrapped in algae. Its face was a void. No eyes, just blackness. A slit for a mouthful of rotted teeth. It whispered something. Her ears bled. Emmett pulled her back, but the thing reached again, this time for him. "No!" she shrieked. The river exploded upward as Emmett was yanked from her grip. The water folded around him like a coffin. Clara screamed until her throat went raw, reaching out, clawing at the tide. But he was gone, swallowed whole by a river that now churned red. Then silence. The river flowed forward again, as if nothing had ever happened. She ran home bloodied and trembling, half mad with terror. Her mother didn't scream when she saw Clara alone. She just collapsed into a chair, eyes hollow. She knew. She'd always known. That night, Clara overheard a meeting in the parlor. Her mother, old Mr. Riggs from the chapel, Widow Irma, and Father Tallow, a strange priest who never blinked and wore bones braided in his beard. "She was chosen," Tallow muttered, spreading a crumbling book on the table. "The river never takes by chance. It demands blood every 50 years. Emmett was the offering." "Will it leave her alone?" her mother asked, her voice breaking. Tallow looked at Clara through the cracked door. "Not forever. The river remembers, and so must she. The years passed, but the horror didn't fade. Clara tried to live a normal life. She avoided the river. She refused to speak of Emmett. But on the night of his death, every year without fail, she heard footsteps outside her window. Wet, heavy, slow. When she turned 20, she left Darrow's Hollow, moved far east, changed her name, married a blacksmith. Another child gone, pulled from the river, just like Emmett. The water flowed backward again. She dropped the letter and turned toward the window. Her breath caught. Footprints, wet, leading to her front door. The door creaked open. Standing in the frame was a boy, soaked to the bone, his eyes milk white. His smile cracked his face in half. "Hello, Clara," he rasped in a voice that was not a child's. "I never told anyone where I went," she gasped. "You didn't need to. The river never forgets." The boy's body twitched violently, bones cracking, limbs bending wrong. Then he lunged and the lamp shattered behind her. Darkness swallowed the room. Clara screamed once, then silence. The next morning, Eleanor found the house empty, the door wide open. The only sign of her mother's presence were wet footprints leading back into the woods. And so the river watched, waiting. The year was 1900, and the town of Darrow's Hollow had shrunk further into the shadows of the Black Ridge Mountains. Fewer people lived there now, fewer still dared to speak of the river, but those who had survived, or escaped, carried the burden of its legacy. They whispered stories, and the young learned not to question what the old ones said. Never go near the water, don't talk about it, and never under any circumstances mention the anniversary. Eleanor Vexley, now a woman of 20, had grown up far from the fog-bound town. Raised by a distant relative who had moved to the city, Eleanor had heard of Darrow's Hollow only in hushed tones. She had no memories of her mother or the events that had shattered her family, but she carried something heavy within her, something her relatives never spoke of, something that had weighed on her like an anchor. It was the nightmare. Every year, like clockwork, Eleanor dreamt of the river. In the dream, she was always standing at its edge. The water was black as ink, and there was always a voice, her mother's voice, calling out from beneath the surface. The river remembers Eleanor. She would wake every time, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. Yet she never dared to seek answers. Fear kept her feet firmly planted in the life she had built far from Darrow's Hollow. But this year, everything was different. Something had changed. A sense of dread settled over her like a storm cloud. Her cousin Fiona had written her a letter, a simple note without fanfare, yet its contents weighed heavily. The letter said one thing Eleanor could never ignore. The river is calling, the anniversary is near. And so she returned. As the train rattled through the mountains and pulled into the decaying station of Darrow's Hollow, Eleanor stood frozen. The town seemed to whisper in the wind. The houses were sagging, choked with vines, as though nature itself was trying to erase what had once been. And the air, it smelled like rot and water. The moment she stepped off the train, a chill ran down her spine. It was the smell of the river. Fiona was waiting for her by the station, looking older than her years. Her face was pale, drawn, as though she had seen things that no one should have. But there was a fire in her eyes, something desperate, something that burned with the urgency of someone who had lived with terror long enough to understand it. "You've come," Fiona said, her voice tight. "I had no choice," Eleanor replied. "What's happening?" Fiona glanced around nervously, as though the very earth might swallow them whole. "It's the anniversary, and this time, it's different." Eleanor followed her through the twisted streets, her heart pounding. Every corner, every dilapidated house seemed to pulse with a dark energy. She could feel the river calling her name from miles away. She resisted the urge to run, but her feet seemed to move of their own accord. When they reached Fiona's house, a small cottage near the edge of town, Fiona slammed the door shut behind them. "We don't have much time," Fiona said, her voice trembling. "I found something. In the old chapel." "Found what?" Eleanor asked, though she already feared the answer. "The book, the one that was hidden in the walls." The walls. Fiona led her to the back of the cottage, to a narrow, cluttered hallway that smelled of mildew and dust. She reached behind a cracked wooden panel, pulling out a leather-bound book. Its cover was black, but it was stained with something dark, something that looked like blood. Fiona opened the book carefully, flipping through yellowed pages filled with strange symbols and text that seemed to shift as Eleanor stared at it. "Do you know what this is?" Fiona asked, eyes wide. Eleanor shook her head, though deep down she felt it. The air seemed to hum with ancient power. There was a history in these pages, a history that tied her family to the river in ways she could never have imagined. "This is the Book of the River," Fiona whispered. "It tells of the curse, of the offering. It demands a life every 50 years. That's the price. And when it takes one, the river flows backward. But," Fiona paused, her face pale, "it says, the bloodline must end. If the bloodline continues, the river will take more." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She took a step back, suddenly overwhelmed. The curse, it wasn't just a story, it was real. She could feel it in her bones. "That's why I've been trying to stop it," Fiona said. "I thought, if we can stop the bloodline, maybe it will end. But I'm not sure how." "I don't understand," Eleanor said, voice shaking. "What am I supposed to do?" Fiona hesitated. "I don't know, but I do know one thing. The river won't let you go. It will keep calling you, Eleanor. And every year when the anniversary comes, it will get closer." The clock on the wall ticked, louder now. The sound seemed to grow, thundering in Eleanor's ears. Her pulse raced. Was it happening already? Suddenly there was a loud crash from outside the house. Eleanor's heart lurched, and she bolted toward the window. Through the fog she saw movement, figures, shadows, bending, twisting as they moved through the mist. But the shapes, they didn't look human. "The river," Fiona whispered. "It's starting." Eleanor's legs went numb, and she stumbled back, barely catching herself. The room felt like it was spinning. The book, the curse, it was all real. And it was happening again. The water was coming. The fog thickened around Fiona's cottage as the sound of footsteps echoed through the town. It wasn't the sound of people walking. It was something heavier, something with intent, the rhythmic thud of wet feet on soggy earth. As Eleanor stood frozen by the window, her eyes scanned the mist, her breath shallow. Something was moving out there, something that had no business being in the living world. "Fiona," she whispered, voice tight with fear. "What is it? What are those things?" But Fiona didn't answer. She stood beside her, eyes wide with terror, staring out at the growing shapes in the fog. They were coming closer. Figures, humanoid but wrong. Long limbs, twisted torsos, faces that barely resembled the living. They were pale, lifeless, their skin peeling and rotting as though they'd been pulled from the very river. Their mouths hung open, not in speech, but in a slow, unnatural, dripping chant. "The river remembers. The river remembers. The river remembers." Fiona grabbed Eleanor's arm, pulling her away from the window, her fingers digging into her flesh. "We need to go. Now!" "But where?" Eleanor choked out, her mind spinning. "What's happening, Fiona? What are they? What do they want?" "They want you," Fiona said in a low, trembling voice. "They want your bloodline. They're the lost, the ones taken by the river, the ones who never made it out." Eleanor could barely breathe. The figures in the fog were growing closer now, moving with that same haunting rhythm. Their eyes, or what had once been eyes, glowed faintly through the mist, like lanterns flickering in the dark. A deep dread filled her chest. They weren't human. Not anymore. Fiona pulled her toward the back door, but before she could open it, a loud crash sounded from the front of the cottage. The door splintered, a massive force slamming it open with terrifying speed. The shadow of something colossal stood in the doorway. A figure, tall, thin, and impossibly twisted, its body half rotted, half wrapped in the slick, black moss of the river. "Eleanor," it rasped, its voice like a jagged stone scraping against bone. The creature was like nothing Eleanor had ever seen. It was as though the very essence of the river had materialized into flesh. Its skin was decayed and slick, dripping with the same inky water she had feared all her life. Its eyes, wide and hollow, bore down on her with an unbearable weight. "Mother!" the creature breathed, though it wasn't her mother's voice. "It's time to pay." Eleanor stumbled backward, heart racing. It was her, the figure that had haunted her dreams. The same voice, the same murderous presence. She couldn't breathe. "No, no," she whispered, shaking her head, trying to step away, but her feet refused to move. She could feel it, the pull of the river. Her skin tingled, her pulse hammering in her chest, as if the river itself had crawled into her veins. This thing, this thing before her, it wasn't just some creature. It was an extension of the river, a thing that had been waiting for her. "Leave her alone!" Fiona screamed, but the creature barely acknowledged her, its cold gaze fixed entirely on Eleanor. It stepped forward, its legs moving in sickening, jerky motions, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Each step sent a ripple through the air, as if the very space around it were distorting. The room was no longer just a room. It felt like the very walls were closing in, pressing down on her as the air grew thick with dampness. Fiona rushed forward, brandishing a knife she'd taken from the table. It gleamed in the dim light of the flickering candles. "You can't have her!" Fiona shouted again, lunging at the creature. The knife sank into its chest, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, a terrible screech ripped through the room, like the sound of thousands of bodies being dragged across jagged rocks. Fiona staggered back, her knife useless, as the creature's grin widened, or rather stretched, until its face split into a horrifying, impossibly wide grin that made Eleanor's stomach churn. It raised one of its arms, fingers long and sharp like twisted roots. It reached out toward Fiona with the slowness of inevitability, a hand that seemed to grow larger with each passing second. "No!" Eleanor cried, her voice breaking. She felt her legs give out beneath her, her knees buckling as if the weight of the creature's gaze had forced all her strength to drain away. Fiona's scream echoed in her ears, but Eleanor couldn't move, couldn't help her. The figure's fingers closed around Fiona's throat, its strength crushing the life out of her, as if she were nothing more than a twig in a storm. The creature's eyes never left Eleanor. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. Gone. Like a shadow retreating into the mist, leaving nothing but the lingering scent of decay. Fiona's body collapsed to the floor, lifeless, her eyes wide in terror. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside her cousin, her body shaking violently. She couldn't even find the strength to scream. But then, beneath the terror, beneath the grief, there was something else. A voice. It came from the river. It was distant, almost imperceptible at first, like a song on the wind. But then it grew louder, clearer, a chant, the same chant that had come from the figures in the fog. "The river remembers. The river remembers. The river remembers." It was calling her. It had always been calling her. Through her tears, Eleanor turned her gaze to the window, knowing what she would see. The fog was thickening, the river was rising, and the river would never forget. It was 1910 now, and Darrow's Hollow had begun to resemble a memory fading at the edges. The town had become a place of half-whispers and avoided glances, its streets eerily quiet, its buildings sagging with neglect. The local chapel, the place where the elders used to gather for secret meetings, was now abandoned, its stained glass windows shattered, the walls covered in creeping vines that threatened to swallow it whole. The town seemed like a ghost of what it once had been, but it was still alive, still breathing, still waiting. Eleanor Vexley had survived the night in Fiona's cottage, though she felt as though her soul had been cleaved in two. She had buried her cousin by the river's edge, the only place she could think of that might keep the curse at bay. But deep down, Eleanor knew the river didn't care for grave markers or bloodlines. The river took what it wanted, when it wanted. For the next few years, Eleanor did her best to move on. She fled Darrow's Hollow, fleeing from the memory of her mother's voice. The creature that had claimed Fiona, the endless pull of the river that would never let her forget. She moved west to a bustling city, married a man who didn't understand her nightmares, and gave birth to a son. But even now, on the anniversary of the drowning, Eleanor would wake in the dead of night, her heart pounding, her mind filled with that unshakable sound. The river, that damned, cursed river. But Eleanor had tried to leave it behind. And for a while it had worked. She hadn't thought of Darrow's Hollow for a decade, not until the letter arrived. It was delivered on the night of the anniversary, exactly 10 years since she had fled. The address was familiar, the handwriting unmistakable, though the name signed at the bottom was one Eleanor didn't recognize. "You must return. The river is calling. It demands your blood." The ink on the page was smeared with something dark. Eleanor could feel her pulse quicken as she read the letter, as though her body remembered what her mind had long since tried to forget. The river was calling, and it wouldn't stop. Her mind whirled with horror as the letter dropped from her fingers. She hadn't been back in years. She had tried so hard to forget that place, the cursed land, the curse of the bloodline. But it had come for her, no matter how far she had run. She was a fool. She had thought she could escape. Her heart was heavy with the knowledge that she couldn't keep her son safe. Not from the river, not from what it demanded. If it had come for Fiona, it would come for him too, for the bloodline never forgot. That night, Eleanor took the first train back to Darrow's Hollow. The journey was long and grueling, the fog thickening as they neared the mountain town. By the time she stepped off the train, the air felt alive with an unnatural, the old chapel, the decaying trees, the endless, dark river that had taken her brother and mother, and now Fiona. It was all still here, still waiting. The town was even quieter than she remembered. Not a soul in sight, except for an old man hunched over a crate of apples in front of the general store. His eyes were sunken, his mouth a permanent grimace. As Eleanor passed him, she heard him whisper under his breath, "The river remembers. It always remembers." Shivers ran down her spine. Her steps quickened. She reached the outskirts of the town, near the banks of the river, where the trees and fog seemed to choke the land. The water was eerily still, as though it too was waiting. The sky above was a sickly shade of gray, heavy clouds blocking out the sun, casting everything in an oppressive gloom. The river wasn't flowing forward as it should. No, it was moving backward again. It was happening. A sound echoed from the depths of the water, a slow, groaning sigh that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The river was remembering. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her throat as she knelt beside the water. She could see the faces now, as she had all those years ago, rising from the depths. The same pale, bloated faces of the lost. But now they were different. There were more of them. The water churned as more figures rose. Not just faces, but whole bodies. The long, twisted arms of people who had drowned, their limbs moving with unnatural, jerky motions. They were reaching for her. She could hear the whispers, growing louder as the dead dragged themselves to the surface. "Eleanor, Eleanor, it's time. You must pay. The river remembers." The faces were closing in on her, the water bubbling and churning as they came. And then, as if from the depths of the river itself, a voice, sharp, commanding, ripped through her thoughts. "You are the last, Eleanor. The bloodline ends with you. The river demands you. Come. Come to the water. You must feed the curse." Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. This voice was different. It wasn't like the others. It was her mother's voice. Her mother, whose face had once risen from the river all those years ago, whose body had been lost to the current. The voice of the river had taken her, twisted her into something other. But now it called her. Eleanor stumbled back from the water, her breath ragged, as the figures from the river began to move toward her, slowly, relentlessly, dragging their bodies across the earth as the mist closed in around her. The fog seemed to thicken into a choking blanket. "No!" Eleanor cried out, as her heart felt like it was being crushed beneath the weight of the river's call. And then, before she could even move, a figure stepped out from the fog. A woman, her face familiar, though older, covered in the marks of time, but unmistakably her mother, Clara Vexley. "You cannot run from it, Eleanor," Clara said, her voice a hollow whisper, as if the words came from somewhere deep in the river's depths. The river takes. It always takes. And in that moment, Eleanor knew what had to happen. The figure of Clara Vexley, Eleanor's mother, loomed before her, its body translucent, shifting like a reflection in disturbed water. Her once living eyes now hollow pits, dark and endless, bore into Eleanor's very soul. The air crackled with tension, the pulse of the river thrumming underfoot as though it were alive, aware, watching. "You shouldn't have come back, Eleanor." Clara's voice was hollow, echoing through the fog. "The river claims what is owed. Your blood is part of its debt." The words sent a shiver of pure dread through Eleanor's bones. Her legs felt as though they were rooted in place, her body paralyzed by the presence of the dead woman standing before her. She opened her mouth to speak, to shout, to scream anything, but the words wouldn't come. It was as though the very air around her was suffocating her, pulling the life out of her, one breath at a time. Clara's hand, pale, clammy and dripping with a dark, tar-like substance, reached toward Eleanor. A thick, unnatural current seemed to swirl around her mother's fingers, as if the river itself were feeding into her. The water surged, rising with a terrible force, pulling the dead bodies from the river's depths as though they were puppets on invisible strings. "Come to the water, Eleanor," Clara continued, her voice now rising, desperate. "The river is calling for you. It has waited long enough." Eleanor tried to take a step back, but it was as if the earth had grown heavy underfoot, her legs dragging through the thick fog. A voice, her mother's voice, sang in her ears. It was not just a sound, it was a presence. The river wanted her. The river demanded her. "No!" Eleanor gasped, her breath ragged as she fought against the pull of the water, against the call of the river that tore through her very bones. The water was alive, surging, as though it had tasted her fear and sought to consume it. And in that moment, Eleanor understood. The river was not merely a force of nature. It was something older, something far darker, something that had always been there, waiting, watching, feeding on the bloodlines that had crossed its banks. It was a curse, not just on her family, but on the very land itself. Her mother had died because of it. Fiona had died because of it. And now it would claim her. Eleanor," Clara whispered again, her voice laden with an eerie reverberation. "You cannot escape. You were born to return. You must join us. In the water." Eleanor's mind raced. She had to do something. She had to stop this. But what? What could she do against the river, against the creature that had taken her family, that had taken her bloodline for centuries? Then she remembered the book Fiona had found, the one she had hidden in the walls of the cottage. It had said something about an offering, about an end to the bloodline. The curse demanded a life, yes, but was there another way? Had Fiona found something? Had Fiona... Before Eleanor could piece it all together, the water surged forward again. It was pulling at her now, dragging her toward the river's edge, and she could feel her feet leave the ground, as if she were floating. The water rose higher, the bodies of the drowned clambering toward her, their limbs stretched and contorted as they reached for her. "No, please," she cried. But the river's grip only tightened, its cold fingers pressing against her skin. In the distance, through the haze of fog and the oppressive swirl of darkness, Eleanor could just make out the faint outline of a figure. Another figure, tall and broad, standing against the current. A man. It wasn't until the figure stepped closer that she recognized him. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Caleb, the man she had married. Her husband. How could he be here? "Eleanor, listen to me," Caleb's voice called out, cutting through the chaos. His form was blurry at first, his edges flickering like a half-remembered dream. But as he moved closer, Eleanor's heart surged with a strange mixture of dread and hope. "You have to leave the river. Don't let it take you." His voice was calm, his words grounding Eleanor, even as the world around her seemed to tremble with the pull of the water. "But Caleb, it's my bloodline. It's my fault. The river. It wants me." Eleanor's voice trembled, fighting the growing panic inside her. She felt the cold water rising above her waist, her legs becoming numb as it pulled her further into the current. "No, Eleanor," Caleb said, his hand outstretched toward her. "This is not your fault. The river doesn't want you. It wants your bloodline. You don't have to feed it anymore. We can end this together." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Could it be true? Could there be a way to stop the curse? Could she truly sever the bloodline's connection to the river? But before she could respond, Clara's voice rang out once more, cold and commanding. "No!" The ground beneath Eleanor's feet cracked, and suddenly she was falling. The river, the fog, her mother. It all consumed her in an instant. Eleanor felt herself being dragged under, deeper into the blackness, toward the abyss. She gasped for air, but it was futile. Her vision blurred as the water swirled around her, the current sucking her deeper. "You must give everything, Eleanor," Clara's voice echoed through the darkness. "The bloodline ends when you do, or you will drown." Everything felt distant. The pressure of the water was suffocating, and Eleanor fought against it, trying desperately to surface, trying to escape the cold hands that tugged at her limbs. But the more she struggled, the tighter the river's grip became. And then, suddenly, her hand brushed against something. Something sharp, cold, and ancient. It was a stone. She gripped it tightly, holding on for dear life. The stone glowed with an unnatural, sickly light. And just as the river's pull threatened to drag her under forever, Eleanor heard Caleb's voice once more. "Let it go, Eleanor. Let the bloodline go." The river pulled her deeper. The weight of it, the blackness, was suffocating, overwhelming. Eleanor's body felt like it was being torn apart, the sharp current clawing at her limbs, dragging her through the cold, dark waters. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of the river was crushing her, drowning her, yet somewhere deep in her mind, a small voice screamed, not in terror, but in understanding. "This isn't the end. It can't be." Her hand still gripped the stone, the cold, ancient artifact that had appeared from the depths. The surface of it pulsed with an eerie glow, a sickly greenish light that spread like veins of poison through the water. It was the last thing that kept her tethered to reality. "Let it go," Caleb's voice reverberated in her mind, distant but clear. "The bloodline ends with you." The words sank deep, clawing into her very core, unraveling the terror, the despair, the helplessness. She could feel the stone in her hand, the power it thrummed with, calling to her. It was something older than the river, older than the curse, something buried for generations, waiting for someone to understand. Eleanor closed her eyes, holding the stone tighter. She thought of her family, of Fiona, of her mother, of all the souls the river had claimed, one by one. The bloodline had always been bound to the river, but it didn't have to be. The bloodline could end. She could end it. Suddenly, the waters around her began to shift. The once violent current slowed, as though the river itself was hesitating, unsure of how to respond. For the first time, Eleanor felt a flicker of control, a glimmer of power in the stone. It felt alive, almost sentient, as though it could sense her fear, her resolve, her decision. The stone flared with a burst of light, brighter than any sun she had ever known. The glow radiated outwards, surrounding her like a bubble, pushing back the oppressive darkness of the river. And then, with a violent jolt, she was pulled upwards. Her lungs burned, her body screamed for air, but she could hear the sound of the river, changing. The rushing water turned to a low, groaning hum. The river was resisting, fighting against her, but the stone was in her hand, and it had more power than anything she had ever felt. It was more than just a simple artifact. It was a key to the end. For a moment, she could see nothing but the light of the stone and the black mass of water pressing against her, suffocating her. Then the light flared, and the water around her exploded in a violent, deafening roar. The world around her trembled. The stone in her hand cracked, and a dark, sickening howl filled the air, echoing from the depths. Eleanor gasped as she was thrust upward, breaking through the surface of the river. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with air. The cold air of night stung her skin, but it felt like the first breath of freedom. And then she saw it, the river. The river that had once swallowed her mother, her family, her bloodline. It was no longer flowing backward. It had stopped. The water was still, eerily calm, as though it were waiting for something to break the silence. But there was something more. As Eleanor's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw the forms in the water, the drowned souls that had once reached for her. They were still there, but their bodies were twisted, decaying, half submerged in the shallows. Their movements were slow, unnatural, like marionettes with broken strings. The faces of the lost stared back at her, but their eyes held no malice. They were empty, silent. The river was no longer alive. It was dying. The stone in her hand pulsed one last time, its glow fading into nothing. The echo of its power settled into her bones, a deep understanding pressing in on her. She had broken the curse, but there was one thing she had not accounted for, one thing that she hadn't foreseen. Behind her, in the shadow of the trees, a figure stepped forward from the mist. It was Clara, her mother, but different now. Her figure was no longer just a half-shadow of the past. She stood tall and solid, her form no longer that of a ghost. She was alive. "You think it is over, Eleanor?" Clara's voice carried the weight of centuries. She took a slow step toward her daughter, her eyes gleaming with a strange, otherworldly light. Her once decayed skin now seemed vibrant, glowing, as though the river had breathed life into her once again. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "No, this can't be. You're not real." Her voice trembled. "Oh, but I am, Eleanor," Clara said, her voice as sweet and chilling as the waters that had claimed her. She reached out with her now flesh and blood hands, the dark power of the river still clinging to her every movement. "The river doesn't just take life, it gives it too." Eleanor recoiled, the realization crashing through her like a tidal wave. This was the final cost of the river's curse. It wasn't just the lives it had stolen, it was the power it had granted to those who were consumed by it. Her mother wasn't the same. She wasn't her mother anymore. She was a vessel for something far older, far darker. The figure of Clara smiled, her lips pulling back to reveal rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "You freed the river, Eleanor," Clara said, her eyes glowing. "And now, it is free to claim all." The chilling smile on Clara's face widened, her sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. There was no mistaking it now. Her mother, the woman she had once loved and lost to the river, was no longer the same. She was something else, something twisted and terrifying. The power of the river had altered her, reshaped her into a harbinger of its darkness. Eleanor stumbled backward, her heart racing in. "No," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with raw defiance. "I will not let this consume me. I will end it here. I will end it with me." In that moment, something in her shifted. The river's pull no longer felt as suffocating. The voices of the drowned no longer whispered in her ears, no longer reached for her. The power of the stone that had been with her, it was still there, somewhere deep within her. The mist cleared, the fog parted, and for the first time Eleanor saw the river not as an unstoppable force, but as a thing bound by something more ancient than herself, than her family. And as the river's grip loosened, she knew what she had to do. With one final shuddering breath, Eleanor closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she released herself into the depths of the river, not to drown, but to finally end it.